And it's above zero here where I am for a change, and that's really nice. The big news out of Ukraine was obviously the Tucker and Putin interview, and our guest is going to go more into that. The other big news this morning was that Alexa Navalny has passed away in a Russian prison.
I'm not sure about that.
Oh, there's my Alexa. Now, Navalny crusaded against official corruption and staged massive anti-Kremlin protests as Putin's fiercest foe. He died Friday in the Arctic penal colony where he was serving a 19-year sentence. The stunning news, less than a month before an election, will give Putin another 6 years in power, and it brought renewed criticism and outrage directed at the Kremlin leader who has cracked down on all opposition at home. His wife had a statement this morning saying if it's true, because these are from Russian sources, so we don't know if they're true till they're verified, then the role of totalitarianism is running rampant in Russia. Now we're on day actually 724. And if you want to catch up on news, I would suggest reading Annie Lee's column in the Daily Costs. And the situation in Avdiivka right now is critical. It's the Russians are coming in. It's much like Bakhmut, and maybe Phil can talk a little bit about that during the show here. And the Russian forces are doing a technical turning movement through Avdiivka, likely to create conditions that would force Ukrainian troops to withdraw from their positions in the settlement. There's been some talk about that, especially with the new general of the forces in Ukraine, Zulushny, who's been classified as a butcher, but he's making public statements saying, no, they care about the Ukrainian soldiers and nothing to worry about. So I want to bring on Phil as our guest, and Phil is a renowned broadcaster, past producer of On 60 Minutes, lives in Kiev, freelance journalist for Fox, for Al Jazeera, all over the board. Phil, you are, and it's my pleasure to have you. And you can catch him on Tom Hartman on Thursdays, bringing us up to date on Ukraine. So how is it going with you today, Phil?
Well, good. I mean, I was shocked by the news today of Navalny's death. It's being in a Russian prison is a really dangerous. Being the ward of the state in Russia is being a ward of the state in Russia is intrinsically dangerous. Whether or not that's in a penal colony or a psychiatric ward or an orphanage or wherever you may be, when you are a ward of the state in Russia, your life is sold pretty cheap. So I don't know if they purposely killed him. I suspect they probably did, especially with the run up to the election happening. It's going to be a false election, clearly, because Putin doesn't hold real elections. I've been eyewitness to 3 Russian elections, and I should say elections in quotation marks. It's a farce, but he could have been a fly in the ointment because he was shining a light on the corruption, not only of Putin himself, but of the kleptocracy that he leads, whether that's Medvedev, his prime minister, or president when he was a placeholder for Putin.
He was poisoned apparently, and
Navalny had been poisoned
survived.
with Novichok, a radioactive isotope, I believe. I'm not a scientist, but I know that there's a radioactive element to it. I know that because of the Skripal case in Britain when I was living in London, and the Skripals were the father and the daughter were poisoned with Novichok.
Like on doorknobs or something, right? When they opened the door, they got transferred.
Those were on a perfume. I believe actually it was a perfume bottle in that case.
Perfume, okay.
that was given to the daughter. And then that was up in Salisbury. They survived that attack, but somebody else who found the perfume bottle was poisoned. This is in Salisbury, England. So I know a little bit about Novichok. Again, not being a full scale scientist, but being a journalist studying what happened in Salisbury, this is a really nasty, nasty poison, and the
Mhm.
Russians have a long history of poisoning. They
So
have a
did the
thing
French,
for it.
though. You know.
Well, yeah, I mean, but like you go back to there was the old story of the Bulgarian dissident who was in London, and you remember you ever hear the story about the umbrella where they
Yes.
stabbed him with an umbrella and it had a wax
Yeah.
pellet that when the wax melted from his body temperature, the poison was relieved.
Yeah.
They poisoned Stepan Bandera in Munich in 55, 56, the Ukrainian nationalist leader,
Which nobody's a
the
fan of.
boogeyman,
Right.
who very few people are a full-fledged fan of. Yes, but he's a he's a boogeyman that the Russians like to pull out and point to.
Hmm.
Whereas people here in Ukraine look at him more as like a symbol of how Russia has stolen their history, because nobody knows Stepan Bandera's story 100%. There are some really ugly things that he did that we absolutely are aware
Yeah.
of.
Yeah.
But the Poles, the post World War II, Warsaw Pact Poles and the Russians are the ones
Hmm.
that wrote Stepan Bandera's story.
That's true.
Again, albeit with some definite things that he did that were pretty. And also, look, man, Bandera. As long as we're talking about Bandera, because he is kind of this thing that the Russians pull out all the time, and I'd like to address like some of these talking points,
Sure.
because they don't really care about Bandera. They pull him out as a boogeyman
Hmm.
to show that the Ukrainians are Nazis. But Bandera was under house arrest in Berlin because he refused to revoke the Ukrainian Declaration of Independence um, from the Soviets, but equally stood, for Ukrainian nationalism against the Germans. Two of his brothers died in Auschwitz. We know that for a fact.
Hmm.
But yes, he was as anti-Polish as he was anti-Russian, but
Yes. Yeah.
he was also he had people killed in family members who died in the Holodomor.
Mhm.
Nobody comes. This is the problem with this part of the continent, is that it is steeped in blood,
Yeah.
and there's no innocence here. So
Blood and
anyhow,
black
but
history. Yeah.
right, well, that's the red and black flag of the UAP, which was actually a Cossack flag symbolizing the black soil of Ukraine, the fertile black soil, the ash in
Hmm.
the soil that it makes it so fertile, and covered with the blood of people who have tried to colonize and control this land, which is again part of the reason why the Ukrainians are fighting so hard right now. Anyhow, so look, uh we got a little way,
Yeah.
getting off
I
topic there
wanted
with
to ask
Bandera
you
and the
about
rest of it, but
Navalny. I,
But Navalny was not. I was not a fan of Navalny. I'll
okay.
say that first and
His
foremost.
politics were suspect, is what you're saying, right?
He was very much a Russian imperialist. He believed in Russian imperialism,
Right.
which is a mindset that is so deeply ingrained in many Russians' minds that it's hard to deviate from.
Right.
He said some very ugly things about Chechens and Muslims in Russia. He was also a bit of an egomaniac who might have been pursuing power for his own purposes.
Well, just on that egomaniac part. So he goes back to Russia knowing he's
Hmm.
probably going to be jailed. That's part of his ego
I
or
think so. Yeah, I mean, I
arrogance,
think his arrogance, his maybe his savior complex.
right?
I'm going to come and even in my martyrdom, maybe I will, become this figure within Russian history, which he probably
And
won't
people will
be.
rise up and vote
And
for him.
people will rise up and whatever. It's look, like so many, he's a complicated guy. Or
Mm,
he was a complicated man with a lot of I know people that knew him far better than me. I never met the man. I know of people who had, and they kind of told me his demeanor, and where he placed himself in Russian society, and where he
mhm.
wanted to place himself within Russian history. Um, and he was very much anti-Putin. So in that, he and I share common ground. And he was very effective in pulling back the curtain on Putin and his ilk, his circle, their corruption. He
Mhm.
was very good with that. Notably, he was involved in uh, a um, uh, a video expose showing the lavish palaces that
Yes.
he and his circle were building in places like Sochi or in the south of France or in Italy. So he did rip the mask off
Mhm.
from the powerful, the great and the powerful in Russia, and in that he and I were of the same mind. He also was, after his poisoning, and you gotta respect the guts of this guy. He goes back. He makes well before he goes back to Russia. He finds out who one of the FSB agents that poisoned him were
On-
and where he was living, and he calls him and pretends to be a superior officer within the security forces, and tricks him into admitting that he poisoned
Yeah.
Alexander Navalny on orders of the intelligence service. So, you know, again, a complicated man, did not
Mhm.
deserve to die in prison, but I'm already seeing, and we got to understand, we're in the middle of an information war with Russia. There's just we need to stop pretending that we're not.
Mhm.
And it is an active war, and there are lives that are being lost as a result of it. But it is an active information war, and so I'm already starting to see the narrative from those who would support Putin, or by extension, um, some of the a lot of the folks within the MAGA crowd who are fellow travelers with um, Putin and the Kremlin. And the two arguments I'm already seeing are, don't make the case that Navalny was a potential threat to Putin in the upcoming elections. He only came in with 2% of support within the people. Well, you know, nobody should believe a single poll that comes out of Russia, because it's a
Yeah.
police state. Who is going
That's
to answer the phone in Ekaterinburg with some guy on the other end of the phone going, "Do you support Alexander Navalny? Do you support Alexei Navalny?" Who's going to say yes to a voice on the other end of a phone? Or some guy that you've never met knocking on your door saying,
yeah.
"Are you for Putin or against Putin?" You know,
Well, I
nobody's
think
going to tell you the truth.
that's true. I think there is an arrogance in the Russian people. I've been to Russian funerals, Orthodox, and the kids in the back of the limousine, their dad has passed away, and they're pulling each other's hair out. And these kids are like between 40 and 50, right? It's just something ingrained into the Russian psyche on how
Well,
they are.
it's about power. It's
Yes.
Russian culture's relationship with power is very much different than what we have in the West, or what how we and for they would argue, at least we don't pretend, we don't hide behind pretense. Whereas you guys, you say you believe in law, you say you believe in equal rights and democracy and inalienable rights, but you really don't practice what you preach. Um, that's their argument. My argument is, at least we try. I mean,
Yeah.
the difference is in the effort.
Well,
And
okay.
they respond to and also, when I say the relationship with power is purely binary.
Maybe they're
in
too
Russia.
lazy to give much of an effort for pretense. And out in the West, we're more energetic.
We could make one could make that argument. I mean, the argument has been made that their much vaunted Russian soul, the Ruskaya Dusha, is really only an excuse to, live in corruption and in drunkenness. I mean, their own writers write about, you read a lot of 19th century Tsarist Russia,
Yeah.
a lot of that literature. I mean, there's a guy by the name of Mikhail Saltykov who says, who writing in like 1850 something, I want to say it was, said, I could fall asleep for 100 years and wake up and I'll still be able to tell you what's happening in Russia, drinking and corruption.
Drinking.
You know,
things haven't changed. No,
things have not changed because it's deeply ingrained in the system, which is part of why Navalny. I find it very hard to make Navalny into a hero. So.
Yes,
But
yes.
it's a sad. And then the before we move on, just a quick other piece of information warfare that I'm already seeing being put out there is that the comparison is being made of Navalny dying in a Russian prison as to an American Chilean citizen by the name of Gonzalo Lira. I'm reluctant to even say his name because he was not a journalist; he was an information warrior.
And he taught people in his prior life how to pick up women in Ukraine. That was his main claim to fame. Yeah.
He came to Ukraine. He originally came to Ukraine as a sex tourist. He left his family.
Yeah.
And there are reports of him being an abuser of his family, and he left and came to Ukraine and became a sex tourist, and kind of in the vein of what's the guy?
Don't say Epstein. Don't say Epstein.
No, the Tate brothers. The Tate brothers.
Oh, yeah. Andrew,
who did this whole kind of Andrew and who did
in
this
Romania.
whole kind of like, right? Who did this whole kind of I can profit off of the sex trade,
right?
In these places because people are so impoverished, and that's what he did. And so Lira was not a journalist, but when first the Maidan and then subsequently the full-scale invasion happened, he found that he could find profit by being a contrarian and by undermining Zelensky and undermining, taking a kind of a pro-Putinist. And the man was a visitor in this country. He was not an accredited journalist. People say that he was a journalist are telling an absolute 100% lie. He was not accredited. And he was involved in information warfare. He was not a journalist. I mean, there is a line somewhere, because we have two words, we have two phrases. We have a phrase called, we call ourselves journalists, and then we have a phrase for information, people involved in information warfare.
Right.
So there's clearly a distinction between the two. It's just, where does that line, where do you cross the line?
He was a media personality.
And I contend he was involved in information warfare.
Yeah, I don't doubt it, and I'm sure he had some handlers from the FSB. So
he was doxing Ukrainian officers. He was, when they raided his house, they found photographic evidence that he was taking pictures of, secured locations, checkpoints and things like that, which even as an accredited journalist, I mean, when I became accredited with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, I signed a whole list of things that I could and could not do. We are a country at war. This country has martial law, and rightfully so. This is a fight for survival. I agreed that I would not show, film or show, secured locations. And he was breaking that. And so his arrest was 100% legit. And then when he was put out on parole, unlike the strength of a guy like Navalny, who, again, I've already said I didn't, I was not an ally of Navalny, but I recognize he had the guts to get on a plane after having been poisoned and return to Russia, knowing full well the possible consequences, as opposed to Lira, who, when he was put out on parole, tried to flee across I believe it was the Romanian border, and was stupid enough to actually post on TikTok that I'm about to break parole and go across the border. And so he was rearrested and put back in jail. Again, I contend 100% rightfully so. He was trying to break parole. He was trying to flee from justice. Sadly, he died in prison. Now, he shouldn't have died in prison. But
Right.
I further contend, and this is me pushing back, the reason I'm going into this in such great detail is because I know that there's going to be information warfare going on when it comes to Navalny. And
Oh, there already is. The Jimmy Dores of the world are doing videos on where's Gonzo.
Yeah, exactly. How can you complain about Navalny dying when the Ukrainians killed Gonzalo Lira?
Yeah.
The Ukrainians did not purposely kill. There is no way you can convince me that the Ukrainians purposefully killed Lira. They're not stupid. They're not stupid. They know that they're, and we can talk about this, by the way, their success or their failure in defending their land is reliant in no small measure on Ukrainian support. So, you know, they may have dropped the ball in terms of caring for his health. He was not a healthy man. He was a chain smoker. He was clearly not fit. You know, and a Ukrainian prison, sadly, as a remnant of the Soviet Union and kind of the Russian way of you know, having prisons, is, you know, they're not summer camps. These are tough, hard places where you are not cared for because the mentality is still there. But I would be, look, it would take an awful lot to convince me that the Ukrainians purposely killed Gonzalo Lira.
No, and that's fair, Phil. That's fair. It was a statement that should be made. So I want to direct your attention to another media personality, though not as famous as Gonzo Lira, is Tucker Carlson and Mr. Putin. So they got together and they had a conversation about history and about various things. I've listened to parts of it. The European journalists are going, it's the same old thing. It's just a boring diatribe from Putin. But a lot of people in the West are going, Tucker is just brave for talking to Putin and those hardball questions. And so I'd like to get your thoughts on that, Phil.
Well, there weren't any hardball questions. He didn't. And also here's the thing. I've thought about this dialogue or this meeting between the two men, because I'm not going to call it an interview. It wasn't an interview. In fact, I hesitate to even call it a dialogue. The interplay between the two was miserable. It was amateurish. Carlson is a bad interviewer. If we're, you know, I rarely watch Tucker Carlson, but I've seen some of his stuff, obviously. But judging by this performance, he is a miserable amateurish interviewer. There was, you know, I have been a journalist for 30 years. I have conducted hundreds of interviews for broadcast, and it was just painfully amateur, just on a professional level, objectively, aside from the content. There was no rapport. Carlson made no effort to build a rapport. No effective. He may have tried, because there were a couple of things that he did where I got the sense he was trying to build a rapport, but he failed miserably because he didn't. It's like a tango, or it's like a dance. Let me put it this way. Here you go. It's like a dance, but Carlson was doing the cha-cha and Putin was doing the tango. You know, they never came on the same level of dialogue. And because of it, it was miserably stilted. Carlson let Putin just ramble on and on and on. It was, you know, this is why we edit things, Tucker. I mean, before he went into the interview, he was making this great thing about, we're not going to edit this. We're going to show it in its entirety because we don't have any limits. We're on this platform, platform that Elon Musk has given us, shamefully, in my opinion, by the way. So we can show it in its entirety. We won't edit it. Well, as a professional, Tucker, from one professional to another, you know, ostensibly, that's why we edit. We get rid of the boring stuff so that it flows better. I mean, even the Russians themselves, when they have been rebroadcasting this interaction, have edited it. That's why we do it. That's why we edit things. We don't edit it to hide things. Well, not necessarily. I'm sure there are,
Oh,
design
that's
factors,
why I edit to hide my
but
goofs.
or to make it flow better, to make it more,
Yeah,
concise
that's right.
and palatable to an audience. And he did none of that. And now we even see Putin himself, pardon me, um, expressing his dissatisfaction with the
Mhm.
way that Tucker, look, there are people who study this part of the world for their entire professional lives. I mean, I'm 25 years in, and I still sometimes feel like I'm only scratching the surface.
Mm.
Tucker flies in to a region that is incredibly complex, which has thousands of years of history, and which is manipulate a history which has been manipulated and is convoluted and difficult, and he just thinks he can parachute in and conduct an interview with Vladimir Putin. It was a hubris for him. I mean, and it was just amateurish. It was so bad. I mean, Putin brings up the point himself now that he was disappointed in the way the interview was conducted. He had an opportunity. Carlson had, even if you want to say Carlson showed up and he was gonna be, pro Putin, that he wasn't going to really put Putin to task. Well,
Hmm.
even then, he still could have asked Putin, "Hey, you've been indicted by the International Criminal Court in The Hague. What is your response to that indictment?" And let him respond to it. He could have said, "Hey, that's weird for a world leader. What's your response? And then Putin could have gone on a diatribe about how the court in The Hague has been politically motivated by Western powers or whatever else, take your pick.
Well,
It's not hard to figure out what Putin's response would be, but he didn't even broach the topic, which is
I I agree with
sloppy.
you here. And Tucker has been on a Russian, even when he was with Fox News, he's been on the Russian train or the bandwagon.
Right.
And some commenters are saying that Tucker was disappointed that he didn't get more mega talking points out of Putin. Um,
Yeah, I think
is
there's
that
one other quick thing that I want to say about
sure?
his line of questioning where he failed miserably. So he
Hmm.
could have asked about the ICC and
Yes,
made news, because it would have given Putin the first opportunity to speak to a Western audience about that indictment. He's an indicted war criminal.
right.
That's weird for a major world leader to be an indicted war criminal in The Hague. Give him the
Hmm.
opportunity to respond. Secondly, there's all this talk in the West and in the United States in particular of maybe seizing Russian assets of about $300 billion and giving it to Ukraine for reconstruction. What do you think about that, Mr. Putin?
That's true.
What if America were to do that? What would be your response? And that would have been news. That would have broken ground, because he has not had the opportunity to respond to that proposition that has been put forward. So it was
That's true.
sloppy. It was amateurish. It was not journalism. And then you're right. He kept trying to push. I mean, his question about, do you see the work of non-human actors, of a spiritual? And
Yeah.
Putin said, "No, what are you talking about? That's stupid." Which was,
Well,
again,
especially
sloppy.
since Putin owns the Orthodox Church in Russia. So,
Yeah, sure.
you know.
And Putin uses religion only in
Oh
so
yes,
much as it gives him power over his people.
for the Ruski
And then you
Mir.
saw the Ruski Mir. Yeah, sure. Go watch a movie called Leviathan, and then talk to me about the relationship with the state and the church. So
Sounds good.
it's a fantastic, powerful Russian movie called Leviathan,
Right.
which just, I'm stunned that they let it out on the international community, because it's 100% indictment of Putin's Russia. Leviathan.
Wow.
Go watch it.
I
Not an
I
easy watch. I will
I'm gonna
warn you, but it is.
I'm
Yeah,
gonna put
it's
that in my notes to watch in the
yeah,
future.
yeah. It's a
I
tough watch. It's a tough watch. But
that's
then,
right.
he kept banging on about, like, why did you think you were about to be attacked? And, what is the reason? And
Yeah.
he's trying to get Putin to say NATO expansion. He's trying, and then he's talking about,
Right.
family values and all the rest of it. He's talking about the LGBT community, and the anti-gay laws in
Right.
Russia. He's trying desperately to get Putin, Carlson is, to get on these MAGA talking points, and Putin just isn't having any of it.
Yeah.
Because I think I really do think they were cross-talking. They just were not on the same wavelength in any way, shape, or form, and it was pitiful.
That's true. And Tucker too, I think he was probably wary of open windows and stuff. So he was trying
people
to
have made jokes about that. I don't think, look, he was not going to kill Tucker. There is no way he was going to kill.
I just throw him in prison.
Or just kick him out of the country. Take his tapes and kick him out of the country.
There
if
you
he
go.
didn't like the way things, if he wanted to be a hard ass, he could have just taken their tapes and said, "No, that was rubbish. You're out of here." But he was never going to kill or imprison Tucker Carlson. Maybe his producers, maybe somebody, maybe his soundman, his cameraman, and his security detail, but never Carlson himself.
Well,
and then his self-serving thing at the end, asking about Evan Gorshevich. The American Wall Street Journal.
There's two journalists being held in Russia right now.
Yeah, the Wall Street. And I mean, that was self-serving, clearly. Let us take him home so he can come, so Carlson could, and that was shot down quickly by Putin.
Right.
It was just, he was completely out of his depth. And then the follow-up we have seen by the other material that he has shot and he's now putting out about him going to the metro.
To the grocery store.
By the way, first on the metro, before we get to the grocery store. I mean, this is all wrapped in the same thing, but
there's more.
Well, they're both examples of him clearly being dragged around by the nose and being shown a Potemkin village, being shown, the bright lights and the beauty and the cleanliness of Moscow, while the rest of the country suffers. And 35% of the country does not have indoor plumbing.
Yes,
this is a modern 21st century nation, ostensibly one of the great powers on the globe, and 35% of their population has to go to an outhouse, especially in sub-zero temperatures. So, get out of Moscow, Tucker, and then tell me what the country's like. But what I thought was particularly interesting of both of those visits, and I could talk about the shopping trip as well, but the thing that sticks out to me in those two little short videos that he put out after the catastrophe of that meeting was that he went to Kievskaya metro. There are so many more. I like Kievskaya metro. It's a beautiful metro, but there are so many other. I mean, go to Ploshchad Revolutsiya, where they have these beautiful statues of these Soviet icons in the statue, from the revolution, or go to the Lenin Library metro station, which is absolutely beautiful with its stained glass.
I have no doubt it's a beautiful city.
It is absolutely beautiful, but there are other beautiful metro stations. What I'm getting at is they purposely took him to Kievskaya. They took him to Kiev metro station to make the point about Ukraine is not really different. It's they show, and it's even more show an example of Carlson's utter ignorance of what is actually, he's being led around by handlers who are playing him for the fool.
Oh, for sure.
He's in Kiev metro, and he is filming and showing the murals there, which are so nationalistic and frankly bigoted against Ukrainians. He shows the mural, a mural of these like ignorant backwater kind of collective farmer Ukrainians in the arms of a Soviet soldier and a member of the Smersh or the NKVD. And he doesn't even know he's showing it. He doesn't even know the meaning of the murals that he's showing. He is,
true.
He was so complete. He goes over there and he says, "I've never been to Moscow. Boy, gosh, oh golly, look how wonderful it is." It's like, you moron. Go to Ekaterinburg. Actually, even Ekaterinburg is not a good example, because the Moscow does throw crumbs out when it feels the need to. But go to a place like Murmansk. Go to Norilsk up in the Arctic Circle, where I went to one. I'll tell you a quick story.
Okay.
When I was a reporter in Russia back in the late 90s, early aughts, we took a trip up to the largest nickel foundry in the world, which is up past Murmansk, just on the border with Norway. And it's a harsh, harsh place. And it's a Mars-like landscape because it's been, pardon me, well, I'm not going to use that word. It has been ravaged by industry.
Right.
And we went and we talked. I'll never forget it. I'll never forget it as long as I live. We interviewed these two kids on the street, and we said, what's it like living in the above the Arctic Circle? What's it like living in this industrial town of metal and smelting and smoke and pollution and smog? And they went, we don't really like it when it's dark all those months of the year. That kind of stuff. Oh, and then when the wind blows in the wrong direction, our parents tell us to stay inside and try not to breathe so much.
Okay, fair enough.
Literally.
Yeah.
Literally, that's how Russians live. Not Muscovites, not Petersburgers, and to a lesser extent, Sochi or Ekaterinburg or some of the other large
It's also
population
telling that most of the people in the Russian army came from the outskirts, not from Moscow or St. Petersburg, but from the outskirts. I want to move over to this Zulushny and Zelensky. Zelensky's let General Zulushny, a well respected individual, go. And now we have General Sikorsky, and yeah, and I'd like to get some of your thoughts on that. Is he a butcher? Is he a good guy? He's was educated in the Soviet establishment and Soviet military. Medvedev has come out and criticized him harshly. He still has parents in Russia. What
he's ethnically Russian, yeah.
Yeah, so Zaluzhny accredited with a lot of good things, though he had some maybe some disagreements with Zelensky. I don't think, judging from the videos after, that they hate each other at all, and I hope he stays part of Zelensky's government and some. So what are your thoughts with was this a good move? Actually, first of all, let me get your take on that.
Was this a good move? I don't know yet. We will have to see how Sikorsky deals. Sikorsky can be effective on the battlefield, and right now there's a fight for Avdiivka, a town called Avdiivka, which is a kind of a transport hub, and the Russians have been trying to get it for 9 years, and it looks like they might be about to take it. It might fall. It depends on how he does in the war, and how he performs on the battlefield. But you're right. They are two very different commanders. And Zaluzhny, I have made the equation of, and it's not perfect, but I like analogies, so I'm going to make this one again.
Phil, I want you to make it perfect, buddy. Make it perfect.
Zaluzhny is Eisenhower to Sikorsky's Patton.
Okay.
So Zaluzhny is a guy who cared for his soldiers, made sure that they were clothed, made sure that as much as they could, that they were taken care of on the line. He had a very severe disagreement with Zelensky. They had a difference of opinion on how to move forward in the war. Zaluzhny, by all reports, wanted a much larger mobilization so that a lot more young men who are kind of not dodging, but who are not,
involved,
signing up.
Right.
Yeah. That they would be conscripted, because they need more men on the front line, because the guys who are there fighting now don't get to rotate off the line as much as they really need to. And so Zaluzhny cared for his soldiers, much like Eisenhower writing two versions of a letter to the, after, in the run up to Normandy, because he was so concerned that perhaps it could be another catastrophe, and that weighed so heavily on him, as opposed to Patton, who, slaps a guy in a med center because he's got, he's become gun shy, and the old, his name of being old, blood and guts, and the soldiers say, yeah, our blood, his guts. That's the kind of difference between their mentalities. Zaluzhny is known as a guy who will put his men in harm's way if it will achieve a military objective. There are stories of him in So he was one of the mastermind. We'll never know. Well, we won't know for a while until probably after the war exactly how the offensive that happened where they regained Kherson. The Ukrainian forces regained a major town in the east called Kherson because they originally made a feint and
Yeah.
made the Russians believe that they were going for a town in the northeast called Kharkiv,
Right.
when really they meant to go for a town in the southeast called Kherson. And it's known that whoever drew up the battle plans for it, and there's some contention about that, but Sersky in operations, and this is pretty well known, was like pushing his men to achieve their military objectives. And famously, the story circulates here of guys, a unit reaching its military objective, calling back to command, and Sersky taking the attitude of, instead of like, well done, boys, secure your positions, put up a perimeter and hold, which is kind of what you do in a military operation, was like, what do you want, a cookie?
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, it was like, yeah, you did what you were supposed to do. I'm not going to praise you. You are soldiers. You obtained your objective. Well done. But I'm not gonna pat you on the head and treat you like a bunch of good schoolboys who
Hmm.
passed their exams, or won the football game. Searcy is a hard man. He will, the reason he gets the reputation of being a butcher, and we'll have to wait and see, is whether or not, he really is a butcher,
Hmm.
or whether he's sacrificing men as opposed to using his men for military objectives. We don't know that yet, but he
Right.
he certainly is a much more harsh character than, I mean, Zulushny, who used to go to meetings with Baby Yoda, like Velcro. Yeah, he had on his battle vest. He had a little Baby Yoda Velcroed on it. I mean, he was a big teddy bear kind of guy. And
Right.
that's
Right.
not to diminish his capabilities as a
No,
soldier. He
not
was
at
also
all.
an
He was
effective,
well respected. So,
and he was and look, also, by the way, he was responsible for commanding the Ukrainian armed forces when the initial onslaught of a Russian invading force was repelled. And for
just
that, he
to
will always be loved.
just to paraphrase that, if I recall, Zelensky and his government didn't think there was going to be an invasion. So Luzhny, he made preparations in case there was an invasion, right? Maybe
Yes.
with the advice of Zelensky too as well. I don't know, but
Yeah,
rumor
I don't
has it
know
it
how
was.
much. Yeah, I don't
Yeah,
know how much that Zelensky didn't believe that an invasion was. I don't know. History will tell.
right.
But I think
He-
Zelensky was aware. I think he was trying to maintain calm.
yeah, well, history has told that their 3 day invasion to where Putin thought he'd
Well,
have it
that's
in
a
10
fact.
days
Yeah.
is now
Oh,
into over 2 years.
which,
So,
by the way, also is another. Just to circle back briefly, because I really
okay.
don't want to give the Carlson thing too much air because it was a
Yeah,
catastrophe.
yeah.
But
I'm done
the
with
one
Tucker.
other. Oh, me too. Me too. I really, if I never talk about Tucker again in my life, I'll be a happy man. But it is worth mentioning. The other thing that got a little bit of traction was this talk of how there was a peace plan on the table,
Hmm.
and that it was scuppered by the West, by Boris Johnson coming to Kiev and
Right,
saying can't accept a peace deal.
right. Which
Okay,
Boris
that
Johnson has said he never said that. So
he
he
never said. He
advised.
also, there's several things about that little segment of the Carlson interview that I'll address, and then please let's put that to rest.
Okay. All right.
Is there are three things that I point out about this argument that the tankies and the MAGA and the Putinites says, the warmongering West has decided, will sacrifice all the Ukrainians and they won't accept a peace deal. Firstly, Boris Johnson didn't come to tell him not to accept a peace deal. Boris Johnson came here hand carrying satellite imagery showing that the Russians were being disingenuous about a ceasefire, and they were, in fact, actually circling around to try and take another run at Odessa. We knew that back then, by the way. This is not new information. Secondly, let's go back to that time and remember that this was about 2 weeks, 10 days after the liberation of Bucha, where Ukrainian soldiers came into this town north of Kiev and found civilians who had been massacred, shot execution style. They were in no mood to be talking peace. The Ukrainians themselves, I think if Zelensky had indeed entertained a peace offer with Putin, he probably would have lost his office. The Ukrainians were rightfully so incensed about what they found in Bucha. So let's remember that as well. And then finally, Putin makes this statement in this dialogue or in this meeting. We were even so willing to, as a sign of good faith, to try and make peace with Ukraine that we pulled our troops out of the territory north of Kiev as a sign of good faith. Baloney, baloney. I've been to Bucha. I've been to the airport at Hostomel where they tried to land airborne troops there.
Mhm.
They didn't leave as a show of good faith. They got there. I'm sorry, I'm going to be a little bit, I'm going to
You
work a
go
little
ahead.
blue. I'm going to work a little blue here. They got
Okay.
their asses handed to them.
Yeah.
They were in full rout. The Russian military, typical of the Russian military, never seems to learn from its prior mistakes. Like in Grozny in the late 90s, they had this genius idea of having a single line of an armored column coming down in a single line trying to pierce into Kiev. And all the Ukrainians had to do was knock out the first tank and the last tank
Mhm.
and then just have at it. And then we saw their supply chain fall apart because their trucks were completely
Oh, yeah.
without maintenance. And
Well,
we know this. We saw
the
it.
Russians were at,
They had to take little minivans from
yes.
inside Russia, these little minivan buses that they have all around Russia and the former Soviet Union, and use them as troop transports.
Well,
Baloney, they pulled back as a show of good face. They were defeated.
yeah, and the Russians during that were asking outsiders which is the road to Kiev. They were poorly managed, but Putin says it
Old
was a show of
Soviet
good
maps,
faith. Yeah, that's true.
and Carlson doesn't push back on him. Anyhow, that's the last I want to talk about Carlson.
All right, I want to talk about munitions or the lack of in Ukraine right now. As you're probably aware, the Senate's approved a bill to send some money to Ukraine, to Israel, and there was one more country, and it's
Taiwan.
held up in the House, and they've went for vacation right now. However,
Shameful.
Germany and the European Union and Canada as well has announced a whole bunch of money towards the Ukraine project. So they are stepping up. There is a lack of munitions in Ukraine right now, if I recall, because Ukraine was shelling up to 9,000 artillery rounds a day, and they're down to about 2,000 or 3,000. Yet the Russians are at 6,000. So I would posit that Avdiivka will, if it falls, will fall because of the lack of munitions. Would that be correct?
Yeah. I mean,
I would
that
think so.
would
Yeah.
it let me put it another way. The only way that
Sure.
Avdiivka is going to stand is by the sheer will and determination of Ukrainian soldiers,
And they've
because they are
already
not,
proven
and
their
they've already
worth with
shown themselves.
Bakhmut. Yeah, with
Sure.
Bakhmut.
Or with Mariupol. Let's
Yeah,
the
Mariupol.
Ukrainians
Yeah.
have done the Ukrainians have, as horrible as it has been, their tactic time and time again, because again, Russia doesn't learn from its mistakes, is to bog down the Russians in a battle and to keep them there as long as possible, and just kill as many of them as they can before retreating. Now, it looks like in the case of Avdiivka, they may have waited too long, and they
Mm.
may get into a situation where Ukrainian soldiers will be encircled. They may get into a situation where, in their retreat, the Ukrainian armed forces will suffer higher losses than maybe they should have. But in no small measure, it is also because they do not have artillery, they do not have ammunition, they don't have air defense, and we feel
Mhm.
that in the cities. I have been witness here in Kiev to attacks, keeping in mind that we have not had a proper supply of defensive, air defense weaponry since since October-ish.
Would that be the Patriot missiles and
Yeah,
HIMARS?
Patriot missile systems and HIMARS not so much for air defense, but yeah, I mean, in S-300s and but yeah, in particular the Patriots, which is an amazing system, but rounds for the Gepard, which is a German anti-aircraft mobile gun system. It's we promised the Ukraine, we signed a document promising Ukraine that we would defend their sovereignty and that their borders, and we're not holding up to that. So even if we're not talking about a dollar sum, which by the way is not that much when it comes to military spending in the United States, we're letting them down. We are abandoning promises that we made unless one man, the Speaker of the House, is holding all of this up. If he were to put it, I contend, if he were to put it to a vote on the floor, I'm more worried about defectors. I'm more worried about defectors in the Democratic Party than I am worried about the Republicans.
Fair enough.
There have been a number of Republicans in the last few days before they went on recess, which, by the way, is another disgrace. There have been a number of Republicans, four, I believe, that I can think of. I don't know their names specifically, but I do know that I've read four different people have openly said, I am not going to be running for re-election, which means they are no longer beholden to the MAGA crowd and canvassing, and kowtowing to that constituency. They can actually vote their conscience. I have spoken to my representative in Michigan's 1st, and his office has pledged support to vote in support of the foreign aid bill. If he puts it, if Johnson puts it to a vote, I do believe it will pass on the floor.
I'm going to agree with you on that very much. Avdiivka, the importance of Avdiivka is, some say it's even worth more than Bakhmut as far as logistics and the railway for supplies.
I mean, it's kind of the high ground sort of situation. It's a transportation hub. Yes, that's true. But you have to understand that entire region of Ukraine, that is the industrialized East,
right,
where there is a vast network of roadways, because, you need to move your smelting here, and then you're prefabricating there, and then you're doing this there. So you have to have this intricate system of roadways to move your
goods, your supplies,
your goods around, your supplies around. Whereas when you go into the kind of the central part of Ukraine and then the western part, it's much more agribusiness, agriculture, logistics and transportation for shipping and things like that.
Let me segue into shipping here for a second, if you don't mind. The grain exports from Ukraine are now over and above since the start of the war. Ukraine, without a navy, has managed to move most of Russian ships out of the Black Sea, or I don't know where they would go, Sevastopol or
no, they went to the eastern shores of the Black Sea. Many of them going to a port called Novorossiysk, which is on the far eastern shore of the Black Sea, pretty much out of, not exclusively out of the touch of the Ukrainians, but they're bottlenecked out in the east.
Which helps because they were firing cruise missiles, I guess, from these ships as well into Kiev and surrounding towns and cities. And every night they seem to be putting drones into Crimea, making sure that those guys are as uncomfortable as possible. What was my point? This year, with the lack of munitions, by the time the America gets their act together and is able to fund, by the time Sweden and everybody in Germany's doing it to get more munitions into the hands of Ukraine, I'm going to suggest this year might be a wash. It might be more of a defensive and well, I'm not to say that they won't make some offensive breakthroughs, but the way it's looking, The one thing we know about the Russians is they're bad at war the first year. Not so bad the second year. We're in the third year, and they're actually learning right now, and they've learned from the Ukrainians, especially about the drones and the EMPs, to down Ukrainian drones. And Ukrainians are so inventive that they're bypassing what Russia can do to bring their drones down, which is appreciated. That's kind of the way it looks by the time they get the F-16s, and that won't be a major, it'll be a major defensive breakthrough for Ukraine to help stop the missiles and stuff. I don't know how much of an offensive force it'll play. It'll depend how many F-16s and pilots they have. And then the munitions is they're struggling right now to get them, and something. So I'm going to posit that it'll probably be kind of defensive till the end of this year. There won't be a spring offensive. I could be wrong, but I don't know your
Well,
thoughts.
we'll see. While Russia is focused on the of the northern section of the Eastern Front in Ukraine, and by that I mean mostly Donbass, there is a foothold that the Ukrainians have on the left
Yes.
bank of the Dnieper River, and they're
Mhm.
holding it. And in some ways, there are reports that they are slowly pushing that out. Now, if they can maintain that, and if they can extend their hold on the left bank of the river, that gets them within about 50 more kilometers. That will put them within firing distance of the land bridge that connects mainland Russia to Crimea, and potentially even if they are able to push all the way to the sea and physically cut off that land bridge, it will be a huge blow to Russia. Crimea is integral to their sense of self as empire, and if you can really put Crimea on the table, and it's unavoidable to Russians to avoid to ignore the fact that Crimea is actually at risk, that will be a huge blow to Russia. Why have we sent nearly, by that time, I'm sure, 500,000 Russians to their death, and we still have the risk of losing Crimea, which is our only year-round warm water port, is a land that Catherine the Great conquered from the Ottoman Empire, and it basically established the beginnings of what we now consider as Russian Empire. It will be a devastating blow to them, and the Ukrainians know it. But you're right; they're on their back heel, they're on their back foot, and unless they get some weaponry in here quick, we'll see what the F-16s do. I don't know. I don't like putting too much stock in any one weapon system, but the F-16 is no small matter. The HIMARS changed the metrics. The Bradleys have changed metrics.
Mhm.
The 777, the M777 self-propelled gun was changed a lot of metrics. So we'll see what the F-16s do when they get here, and they will be here soon. There has been even speculation they're already here, and we just don't know it because the Ukrainians have now said that we're going to change the way we do things here. We're not necessarily going to telegraph what it is we have. But you're right to mention the Black Sea, and also worth mentioning that the Ukrainians are not just hitting willy-nilly whatever
Right.
vessel is out in the Black Sea. They are picking their targets. If you'll notice, what they have sunk are
Tell me more.
primarily they have primarily struck missile frigates, which are shooting cruise missiles at their cities, and they are targeting landing vessels, which would potentially be used in some sort of amphibious assault on Odessa, keeping in mind that by their own admission, Odessa is still something the Russians believe they can reconquer, that they can take. They can take Odessa. I have been to Odessa 3 times since the full scale invasion happened 2 years ago. Three extended trips of at least a month in the last 2 years. I will tell you this: they have lost Odessa forever. Odessa will never be reconquered. Odessa it's a fortress, okay? The people of Odessa have turned it into a fortress. The hatred, not just animosity, not just, frustration, but outright hatred of the Russians is palpable. You go down to Odessa, and the people there despise the Russians. They will put up a fight that will, evoke memories of Stalingrad. They will fight for
Mhm.
every apartment building. They will, when the Russians are forced to destroy this crown jewel of their own making by their
Mhm.
reckoning on the Black Sea, this beautiful city that Catherine established. If they are forced to flatten it to the ground, they probably will. But the Odessites, as they like to be called, will counter. They will fight from the rubble. They are Odessa. Odessa is known as a very, very stubborn city, and it's rightfully they've earned that reputation. That
Well,
they bulk at the power of the capital in Kiev, and now that they have turned against the Russians,
mhm.
they will fight. Just they're stubborn mules. They think they're like they're like San Franciscans, or like people from Melbourne or Vancouver, who,
Yeah.
like, we live in a very, very special place,
Mhm.
touched by Cape Town is another example of this, I'm told, although I've never been.
Fair
But this
enough.
kind of mentality of we are a special, special place, and we don't take orders from anybody. It's part of a port mentality, I think, port town mentality.
Right.
But they I think it was the church. I think it was when the Russians demolished it's the Church of the Resurrection, I believe. Um, a beautiful church. I've been to it, and some debris from anti-aircraft or a Russian missile really did significant damage to this church. And I think that was what it was. I think that because you saw when it happened, the entire city came out, not because they were mandated. They came out and picked up rocks and stones and
Right.
bricks and piled them up to be carried away and carted. It was a moment in their history there was, and I've spoken to, many, many, many people who live there, and they say that was it.
Well,
That when
I
they hit that church, it was like, no,
right.
we're never going to be Russian again.
Well, I've had discussions or rather arguments about Crimea being Russian or not, and my point has been there was a lot more Ukrainians there till they deported them and brought in the Russians, which is a Russian tactic, right, to displace the people in
Yeah,
the area,
ethnic cleansing.
right? So we've only got a few minutes, but want to talk to you about do you think Ukraine should have the capability of using Western arms into Russia? Now, right now, they're using their drones. They're doing a wonderful job getting the oil refineries blowing up somehow, and maybe that's the special forces as well of Ukraine going in there, and they're blowing up drone factories. Russia is also blowing up drone factories in Ukraine, and I see they're not big anymore. They've spread them out, smaller versions of drone factories, from what I've been reading. Do you think? Well, first of all, do you think a Western weapon should be used against Russia, since Russia's using North Korean weapons in the Ukraine, or
I mean,
is that a line that we just won't cross? But if Ukraine builds a weapon that goes into Moscow proper and stuff, should they use it? Obviously on
yes.
military
Oh,
targets.
absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, yeah,
If it's their own weapon,
you're right.
and they've been developing weapons. I mean, they've already hit Moscow several times. They've hit,
Yeah, and Belgorod. Yeah,
and Belgorod and St. Petersburg
yeah,
and Rostov, and there are many places that Ukrainian forces have struck.
right.
Do I want to see an F-16 flying in Russian
Ooh,
airspace?
mm.
Ooh,
Tough,
boy,
tough one.
tough, tough,
Yeah.
tough, 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 tough stuff. But as unpalatable as this is for the West to accept, we're already at war with Russia. It's online right now. It's an information war. It's a war, and there are casualties, very real casualties in that war.
Mhm.
But we got to get our heads around the fact that, like it or not, Russia sees itself at war with us. They think Ukraine has been seduced away by the Americans. They don't blame, they're in a very condescending way, just like in the metro in Kiev. They have
Yeah.
a very a metro in Moscow, Kiev station in Moscow. They have a very condescending attitude towards Ukrainians. And they can't accept that Ukrainians would have agency and decide to reject them. So they're already at a place, the Russians, where they're saying, our enemy is not in Kiev, it's in Brussels and in Washington, D.C. And ultimately, really, if you push them, it's Washington, D.C., because they think NATO, much like Donald Trump, they think NATO is some sort of, client state for the Pentagon. Clearly, neither Putin or Trump understand NATO. But if we push that too far, I don't know what the response will be.
Right.
Again, I still don't think that there will be a nuclear response, because once you ring that bell, you can't unring it. And if they do use a nuke anywhere, whether it's here in Ukraine or, God forbid, at a NATO ally, we're going full fledged. It's Third World War. It's no fly zones. It's NATO troops right on Russia's border, if not internally inside Ukraine. You can't use a nuke and not expect a dire response. These weapons are, I mean, they're using them is a show of complete disdain for whatever rules of warfare there are. So would they respond with a nuke? I still contend no. But there's every possibility that they might try a feint into the Baltics. They might try actually going into Poland. I mean, this gets into a whole other range of level of conflict. Now, you say that you point out Russia's military history, and that the first year they tend to kind of get their butts kicked, and then they kind of level out in the second year, and then they kind of they I mean, this is the Winter War model. This is the Finnish War model. Well, here's the thing. Russia in the last 2 centuries, was a couple of notable exceptions, including arguably Finland, although the Finns held on to their sovereignty. They just lost territory. You could argue about Chechnya, but a distinction also has to be pointed out in that Russia in the last 2 centuries, give or take, has never won a war where it has not been part of a coalition. Napoleonic War, they had the Prussians, they had the British, they fought off the French in a coalition of allied powers. Obviously, the Second World War, they don't like to admit it, but there's no way they could have won the war against the Nazis had we not been flooding
the Western.
If American merchant marines had not been bringing boatloads of Sherman tanks
right
to Arkhangelsk,
but according to Putin,
they wouldn't have won.
According to Putin's conversation with Tucker, Poland started the Second World War because they wouldn't give over its lands and its people, and
obviously overlooking the Molotov-Ribbentrop.
The fact that the Soviets were in bed with the Nazis and came over and decimated Ukraine and Poland.
You also have to consider that despite what a lot of people have you believe, their economy is in a very precarious place. We'll have to wait and see.
Phil, what bugs me about that is, with all these embargoes that are supposed to be there, why are the Russians still making money, right? Their oil was going to India. India is now not going to take their oil, but they're making money. They have, there's Ukrainian troops looking after Wagner forces in Africa, apparently, which is a source of wealth for Russia and for Putin especially, from the gold mines there. I think my comment on this is a war that never needed to be started. It was somebody's egotistical. It's a stupid war. Like most wars are stupid, but this is even stupider, especially if the the Ruski Mir
Well,
people are saying we're one
it's
people. Well,
Moscow's,
you know,
yeah, it's Moscow's inability to accept that it is no longer an empire.
yes.
And they can't, they don't want to. I lived in Moscow in the 90s. I they don't, they know the they know the changes that need to be made in their own country. They know
Mhm.
where the faults lie. They know it better than we do. If you put a couple of shots of vodka or a couple bottles of vodka, there's really it is the reality, into a Russian, he'll tell you he knows. He knows the changes and the project, or the one of the, not revolution, but the
Oh, there's riots
uh,
when they try to raise the price of vodka in Russia.
oh yeah,
So,
no, but here's the thing about Russia is that, and I've said it many times before, nothing happens, everything happens. This is their
yeah,
history, and it's a cycle of history. Is that they have to, they they push it to the absolute point where it has to be bloody and violent for there
yeah.
to be a change in Russia.
Just
And
like
I'm
those
sorry,
kids
but
in the back of the limousine.
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he's going to, Putin is going to push this as far as it will go, because he's painted himself into a corner, and his sheer survival, is reliant on what happens with this war. But
Right.
what I think, and I think everybody knows this, is that how far can he push it
Hmm.
before Russians themselves take to the streets? And I had hoped that it would be a palace coup in Russia, but the longer this goes on, the more I think it's going to be in the streets, and it's going to be bloody.
You know,
But Russia has to change.
right off the bat, I thought to myself, anyways, was that if the West doesn't give Ukraine what they need to try to make this a quicker end to the war, this thing would drag out. And we are in a defensive posture on both sides actually right now. I'm not going to say attrition, but it's wintertime, so we'll see what the spring. Phil,
Well, yeah,
before
but the spring is coming.
yes, it
There's
is.
already a change in the weather here, and we are headed away from winter and into spring. We will see, but it's also, there's talk of larger mobilization here. There's talk of morale. I
Right.
can tell you. Okay, let me just put this to bed, and then we can, wrap it up. But it's important
Okay.
to mention
Yeah, by all means.
this country remains 100% resolved to resist Russian occupation.
Mhm.
And even if, God forbid, their conventional armed forces are routed and in defeat and in disarray, which I do not believe will happen. Even let's say that hypothetically were to happen, there will then have to be an occupation of this country, and it will
Mhm.
make Iraq look like a, a, a Boy Scout jamboree. These people are never, the thing that Moscow has, and Putin, and even indeed the West, has not recognized, is that we have turned a corner in Ukraine, and Ukrainians have turned a corner. They are sovereign for the first time in their history since Olga there, you know,
Yeah.
since Olga of Kiev in the 10th century. They have a nation, they have a country called Ukraine, and they're not going to give it up. So if we abandon, the only thing that's going to happen, if we really do abandon this country, as the Republicans and the MAGA types would have us do,
Mhm.
it's not going to stop the war. What will happen is we will watch from the sidelines, and this is not hyperbole, as a genocide happens in Ukraine, because they will not stop fighting. They will not stop resisting Russian occupation. There will be an insurgency. There will be partisan and guerrilla warfare. And the
Mhm.
only response that Russia has to that will be to fall back on its old tradition of rounding up just men, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of men of fighting age, and probably some women,
Mhm.
and putting them into camps, and frankly killing a whole bunch of them, show trials and all the rest of it. And we will sit there and watch as massacre after massacre after war crime happens in Ukraine, and we will sit and watch it happen and know that much of that blood is on our hands, because if we had given them the weapons to defend themselves properly, arguably from the get-go, but that's for another time, that we will have abandoned these people, betrayed the promises that we gave them in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum Agreement. and it will be a message to both our allies and to our enemies that we don't have the fortitude to stand up against the bully who wants to seize power in the 21st century and take territory by force of arms. It will be a great disgrace and a moment in our history which we will regret for a very long time, not to mention the sheer scale of human tragedy that is already happening here. But I will argue, in the situation where there is an insurgency and an occupation by Russia, that will be, something akin more to the 19th or the 20th centuries than what we should be seeing in the 21st.
Oh, you got that right. Bill, if you can hang on for a minute, and I'll close out the show. It's just wonderful talking to you, Phil, and your wealth of history and being there in Kiev and bringing a perspective to us guys out here in North America who aren't fighting the fight, even though we have lots of people from Ukraine coming into my city, and I get to hear stories. It's nothing like what you espouse, and you paint a picture of what's going on. So I really appreciate it, Phil. Thank you very much, and I hope we can have you on again soon.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak to your audience. I would be happy to come on again. If you are an American listener or viewer,
we have lots of Americans.
Now is the time. Now is the time to call your elected officials. This is probably the most important inflection point. If you haven't called before, and if you do believe in helping a people to throw off their imperial masters, which is what this is a war of colonization.
Right.
If you believe in a people to have the right to self-determine, and if you believe in keeping your word and promises that we made, now is the time to call your elected officials. So
100%.
Thanks for letting me talk to your audience, and for anybody who's listening, now's the time to call your elected officials.
Thank you, Phil. And if you could hold on 1 minute. I'd like to thank Phil for coming on with us. I really appreciate it. And the one thing that Putin, in his debate with Tucker, if you can call it that, his conversation was, at one time there was no Moscow or Muscovy. It was Kiev. Kiev was the ruler of those lands, and they stretched right through Moscow. It's amazing he didn't say something like that. I'd like to thank you very much for listening today, and our audience, thank you very much.